Good morning, colleagues, public. It is 9 a.m. and I would like to call to order the teleconference meeting of the Transportation Committee today, Thursday, November 18th, 2020. Before we begin, please note that this meeting is being recorded. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. Starting with Director Hill,
Here.
Director Maston,
Here.
Director Melgar, absent Director Rabbit,
Here.
Director Rodoni,
Here.
Director Snyder,
Here.
Vice Chair Arnold,
Here.
Chair Fredericks,
Here.
and President Parr.
Here.
Thank you. You have a quorum, but you are also you are actually a committee of the whole. And also on the line, we have Directors Cochran, Garbarino, and Theriot. So I'm going to confirm staff on the line. Dennis, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Joe Wire,
Yes.
Ava Barr Furbish,
Present.
Kim Manolius.
Good morning.
Good morning. Steve Miller,
Good morning.
Jim Swindler, not on the line. Mona Babauta,
Present.
thank you. Kelly Hopper,
Good morning.
thank you. Good morning. And also on the line this morning, we have Ann Richmond and Dan Cherrier with TAM, and that confirms staff on the line.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I'd like to remind everyone to mute their phones until after the staff presentations. And remember to unmute and identify yourself when we open up for director discussion. If there are any comments or questions, the Secretary or I will call on you accordingly. Following our discussion, we will ask for any public comment before moving on. Please follow along by referring to the page numbers located at the bottom of your meeting packet pages. Excuse me. We will start with Agenda Item 3, which is the reports of the district's accessibility, bus, and ferry advisory committees. The brief report is on page 3. It notes that there were no meeting information present at the time of mailing for this meeting. Before we move on, are there any questions or comments from the directors regarding item number 3? I'm hearing none, Madam Secretary.
That's
Do you hear
correct.
any?
I hear none.
That concludes the discussion on this item. Before we move on, Madam Secretary, is there anyone from the public wishing to speak on item 3?
We have no speakers under this item.
Thank you. No action is required for item 3. We'll move to agenda item 4. This is a slide presentation that begins on page 4 of your packet regarding northbound 101 to eastbound I-580 direct connector project by the Transportation Authority of Marin. Dennis, please introduce the presenters for this report.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I want to thank the Transportation Authority of Marin staff for coming today to make a presentation on this very important project. With us today is the Executive Director, Ann Richmond, and Dan Cherrier from her staff. And this is a vital project to the Bridge District because we provide bus service across the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. We also care very passionately about a community of interest adjacent to this project, the Canal neighborhood in San Rafael. Plus, we have a property interest in the area. But with that, I'll turn it over to Ann and Dan.
Thank you very much. Good morning. This is Ann Richmond, the Executive Director at TAM. And as noted, I'm here with the project manager for this project, Dan Cherrier. Thank you for inviting us to present at your committee meeting this morning. And as noted, there is a slide presentation for this item, and I'll try to keep up with the slide numbers as I go through the item. So if you go to what's page 6 in your packet, the slide titled Welcome and Introduction, just by way of background, this project is attempting to address the fact that currently there is no direct access between Highway 101 northbound and Highway 580 eastbound to the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge in the San Rafael area of Marin County. Traffic volume and delays are expected to continue to grow in this corridor, and building a connection on this freeway to freeway area has been identified as a priority for about the last 10 years and has received local and regionally approved funding. Next page, slide 7. So currently there are 2 routes to access the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge from northbound 101. Both involve exiting the freeway onto local roads, either Sir Francis Drake Boulevard or Bellum Boulevard. So what this slide shows is that if we don't do anything over the next 20 years or so, Sir Francis Drake Boulevard will become more congested. More vehicles will start to use the Bellum Boulevard route to get to 580 and the bridge, and travel times will continue to increase. So from the Tamalpais on-ramp to the Bellum off-ramp, the current trip takes about 13 minutes, and by year 2040, if there's no freeway connector built, that travel time will about double to 25 minutes. So this project attempts to provide a better connection to the bridge and to get that bridge traffic off of local roads. Next slide, page 8. So although this project is primarily scoped to address this direct connector, we have heard through this initial outreach phase that there are local improvements along Bellum that the community also desires. And so we will be looking to see if those can be incorporated as part of the connector project. These could include improvements along Bellum itself and some of the nearby roadways, as well as bicycle and pedestrian safety and connectivity improvements. We've been working with the city of San Rafael on this already, and we'll continue to explore this with more input from the community. Next page, number 9. So the project goals have been refined over the last year or so with input from community and other stakeholders, and are shown here. So the first goal is to build the new freeway-to-freeway connector to improve connectivity and traffic flow for both local and regional traffic. It's intended to separate the kind of the freeway traffic from the local traffic and thereby help reduce local traffic congestion. As I mentioned, it's also intended to enhance the bicycle and pedestrian network in the project area. Through the planning work that we've done over the last year or so, we've also added this goal about equity, promoting equity for all users, particularly members of historically underrepresented communities within the project area, and that is largely referring to the Canal neighborhood in East San Rafael. The last goal is that the project should be designed such that it does not preclude construction of a future connector going the other direction, so from westbound 580 to southbound 101, where there also is no direct freeway-to-freeway access right now. Next page, slide 10, shows the expected project timeline. So right now we are in what I would call an early planning phase. We have not even started the environmental document yet. We're expected to kick that off in 2022, and that should take a couple of years, and then we would move into design, a right-of-way phase, and construction planned to wrap up around 2030. So it's a pretty sizable project with a commensurately sizable schedule. Next slide, slide 11. So this project has actually been included in a fair amount of earlier planning work. It was in the TAM 2017 Vision Plan. It's included in Plan Bay Area 2050. It was included in Caltrans's Comprehensive Multimodal Corridor Plan for US 101. And because of the interest in the project and the work that's already been done to envision it, it has actually already secured a fair amount of funding through Regional Measure 3, which has $135 million for this project, and through TAM's local half-cent transportation sales tax, which set aside about $16 million for planning and local improvements connected to the project. Slide 12 shows some of the groups that we've conducted outreach or meetings or discussions with already over the last year or so. So there's kind of a committee structure that we set up for this group that has a technical committee, an executive committee, a stakeholder working group, and an ad hoc committee of the TAM board. We've had meetings with cities and local agencies, and in addition to the ones shown here, we've also met with Larkspur staff, with Marin Transit staff, with Golden Gate staff. We've done presentations or had more kind of small meetings with a number of community organizations shown here. We've had meetings with some of the nearby property owners. Just this week, we had a study session with the City of San Rafael's council. We've actually presented in front of them 3 times now. And we expect to bring more additional information to the TAM board over the next couple of months to help us with the alternatives discussion as we head towards the environmental work. So next slide, slide 13, shows the composition of the stakeholder working group that we have been meeting with. We've had, I think, 6 meetings with this group, and it comprises about 20 different individuals or interest groups, about half of which are kind of specific to the San Rafael area, and the rest are more sort of county-wide interests. And the meetings that we've had with them have been open public meetings. All the information is available on TAM's website from all of the meetings if anyone is interested in looking over that information. So the next slide, number 14, provides an overview of the alternatives that are being considered at this point. There are 9 different alternatives right now that have different alignments, different design speeds, different costs, and I'll walk through each of them quickly just to kind of give you a sense of what we're looking at right now. As I mentioned, we're in what I would call an early planning phase right now, and the intent of the outreach that we're doing now, including the discussion with you all today, is to narrow down the alternatives to those that are most feasible to study further in the environmental phase. We do not intend to bring 9 alternatives into the EIR process. We would really like to get that down to 2 to 4 alternatives or so through these community and agency discussions. So the next slide, slide 15, is just to kind of highlight or remind everyone that this project will include improvements in the Bellum Boulevard area, regardless of which alternative for the connector ultimately moves ahead. So these would include potentially protected bike lanes, sidewalk improvements, bus stop improvements, streetscapes. The designs shown on this slide are just conceptual, just to kind of give an idea, but over the project development process, we would be working with the city and with the neighborhood to really decide on what changes would actually be made. So slide 16, going through the alternatives in a little more detail, and I recognize that some of you may be more or less familiar with this area of Marin, so I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So this alternative 1A, is one of 2 options that we refer to as the Hillside Alternatives. And these both kind of come off northbound 101 at the top of that hill that's between Larkspur and East San Rafael. This one would wind down along the hillside to meet up with 580, kind of closer to the bridge. This one would go through some open space and private property, including property owned by the Marin Sanitary Service and the Central Marin Sanitation Agency. These hillside options are the highest speed options in terms of how fast a vehicle could travel along them, and they are also the highest cost options. So slide 17, the next page, shows a rendering or bird's eye view of this Hillside 1A option. You can see on the right side of the slide where it comes off of 101, and you can see as it sort of cuts across the middle of the slide there would be new bridge structures, new retaining walls, and new fill that would be required as part of this alternative. The next slide, page 18, shows alternative 1B, or Hillside B. So this one would also leave 101 kind of further up on the hillside. It's actually stays a little bit higher up than 1A, but it does still skirt along portions of the Marin Sanitary Service property and the Central Marin Sanitation Agency property before it meets up with Highway 101. This one would also require reconstructing the flyover that connects to Francis Drake Boulevard to Highway 580 because of where it touches down on 580. So this one is also a higher cost and higher speed alternative. Slide 19 shows a bird's eye view or rendering for this 1B alternative. You can see the new retaining walls and slope cuts that would be required to make this alternative happen. So slide 20, moving down the hill somewhat, shows alternative 2, which we call the Sims Street alternative, and that's because it would come down a little bit lower off of Highway 101, go over kind of short street in San Rafael called Sims Street, and then connect up to 580. So this one is a lower cost alternative, but it also has a lower design speed because of the curve and the slope of the connector. And this would create a new structure in this part of San Rafael. So that's, you can kind of see that on the bottom part of the slide there where it shows an elevation view. Slide 21 shows alternative 3A or low speed A. And this one is really tucked into the corner between 101 and 580. It's behind the Marin Square Shopping Center, for those of you familiar with that area. And a feature of this one is that the Bellum off-ramp from 101 separates from this connector on the left. So you'd have the connector on the right and then the off-ramp on the left. This alternative is expected to have a lower cost. It also has a lower design speed because of the curve and a smaller structure. So you can see on slide 22 a rendering of what this alternative could look like. Slide 23 shows alternative 3B or low speed B. This one's a little bit similar to 3A, but the configuration is different in that the off-ramp and the connector stay together longer, and the off-ramp only kind of splits off after you go around the curve there. Because of that, this alternative would mean that the exit at Bellum from 580, not from 101, but from 580, would need to be closed off. And it would also require changes at the Anderson Drive on and off ramp shown kind of towards the left on this slide. This alternative has raised concerns with the community because of that off ramp closure. Members of the Canal neighborhood and East San Rafael businesses are concerned about reduced access to those neighborhoods, and therefore have kind of told us pretty clearly that they don't favor this alternative. And you can see in the rendering on slide 24 what this one would look like, again, kind of tucked in behind the Marin Square Shopping Center and somewhat lower profile. So slide 25 shows a modified 3B alternative, and the community concerns that I just mentioned had led us to develop this modified 3B over the course of the community discussions in the last year. So this one would reestablish that connection to Bellum from southbound 101 or eastbound 580. It does create then a pretty complicated intersection at that off-ramp that we would have to figure out how to run in terms of the traffic signal operations and the kind of pedestrian crossings that would be needed in that area. So this one has also somewhat low cost, lower design speed, but was developed to respond to the particular community concern about access. Slide 26 shows a rendering of that modified 3B. So you can see there's kind of a off ramp that comes off of 580 or 101 southbound that crosses over the 3B direct connector. So this one has some fairly complicated geometry, but does try to address that community question. Slide 27 shows alternative 4, which we call the swing out alternative. So this one comes off 101, sort of midway down that hill. Then it actually crosses over the 101 freeway, curves around, and crosses back over 101 to join 580. So you might ask why there would be a design that does that. And this one was developed because the structure would be almost entirely in public right-of-way, so has very minimal private property impact. However, it is a pretty tall structure, 90 to 100 feet, does cross over 101 twice, and like that 3B option, this would also require closing the 580 Bellum exit. So again, some community concerns with this option. This has kind of a medium price tag and one of the lower design speed options. I promise there's just a couple more of these. So slide 28 shows alternative 5, which we call a medium speed option. So this is sort of in between the Sim Street option and those 3A, 3B options, comes off the freeway a little lower down, actually goes over the Marin Square Shopping Center, and then meets up with 580. And this one also has not garnered that much community support so far. It does have kind of a medium cost and a medium design speed. And then the last one that I'll walk through is alternative 6, the Anderson Drive Midway alternative. This one comes down off the hill, goes over what's currently kind of a storage area, and then actually would go over through the Golden Gate Transit facility on Anderson Drive. And so this is probably the one that you all might have some comments on. It would potentially impact the operations at that facility, both during construction and in the longer term. There would need to be some kind of right-of-way or access agreement between Golden Gate Transit and Caltrans. It's a fairly high structure as well, and kind of a medium to high cost, medium design speed. So the table on slide 30 provides a summary of the alternatives, all the design speeds, the costs, and then whether they close that 580 off-ramp to Bellum. And again, just to highlight that that was a key factor in some of the community discussions. So the costs range from about $114 million to just shy of $400 million. These cost numbers, I should note, are preliminary. They're based on a very low level of design. They're likely to change, and the more we get into the kind of operational improvements in the Bellum corridor and figure out what changes really are needed there, that's going to be a key factor affecting the costs as well. You can also see the design speeds range from 35 miles an hour to 50 miles an hour. And I should note, we have been talking to Caltrans about this project as well. We don't really have formal feedback from them at this point, but they are aware of the project, and we expect to continue discussions with them probably throughout the life of the project development. So slide 31, just to kind of provide a high-level concept for the future connector that I mentioned when I was talking about the goals for the project, that the design should not preclude a future connector for westbound 580 to southbound 101. So this slide just shows a very conceptual rendering for a connector in roughly the same area as the alternative 3A, 3B set of alternatives. But depending which alternative is ultimately selected for the direct connector project, the design for this kind of subsequent phase connector, could be in the same area as the direct connector, or, subject to all kinds of future design considerations. So to wrap up on slide 32, looking ahead for the next year as we move from this planning phase into the environmental phase, TAM and the project team will try to narrow the number of alternatives to a smaller number, say 2 to 4 for detailed review to bring into the environmental work. We have been doing a fair amount of community engagement already, but we plan to beef that up during the environmental phase. So in addition to the kind of formal public outreach components of environmental documents, we also have some more focused work that we have been developing for the Canal neighborhood to kind of provide additional information to residents in that neighborhood and really help them contribute to the discussion about the project design. Once we kind of move into the environmental phase, of course, we'll do the kind of required environmental scoping and public input processes as well. So that concludes the presentation, and we look forward to your feedback and to answering any questions.
Thank you, Anne, for an informative and important presentation. Dennis, do you have anything to add?
Yes, just briefly, I want to thank Anne and her team for all the great work they're doing on this very important project. Your staff supports the project goals and objectives as presented by Anne and as reflected on the slide on page 9. I do wish to clarify that Caltrans will ultimately own and operate this facility. And so if alternative 6 is selected and staff is not opposed to any of these alternatives, we're very early in the process, Caltrans does not have access agreements. They own fee title, they own the underlying property below elevated structures, and they control access unless it's prevented by law, such as for railroads in the federal government. That doesn't exist here. So if alternative 6 is selected, they would have to reconfigure and reconstruct our bus yard, and they would have to pay all those costs as part of the project. And that's something that could be done because fortunately we do own some land adjacent to our existing bus yard that we've leased to the Marine Airporter. So I just wanted to put that out there that we're very, very early in the process. Staff is working with TAM and their team, and I just want to commend them on all the good work they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And are there any questions now from the directors on item 4?
Director Maston, I have a question.
Director Maston, I heard you first. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So does the preliminary cost include acquisition of property?
Yeah, this is Ann Richmond. So it includes kind of our best estimates at this time for acquisition of property. Now, of course, that could be subject to all kinds of things once
Sure.
The design is further along and there are, more known and more discussions, but it does include some placeholder figures for that at present.
Okay. So my comment would be that, it seems that alternatives 1A and B, possibly 2, would have the least impact on existing traffic during the construction phase, which would be, for me, a consideration, plus the higher design speed seems like one of the goals for this project. Cost aside, of course. Just my comment, and that's it for me.
Thank you, Director Maston. There was another comment. Would someone else like to comment?
This is Dick Grosboll.
All right. I think Bert popped up first.
I think he did, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly, I understand that working with San Rafael, you've lowered the most highest favor to 3 alternatives. Could you tell us what those are, or if that's the case?
Sure. So we had what was called a study session with the City of San Rafael Council this week. So it wasn't necessarily a formal action, but the feedback that we got from the council members was to focus on alternatives 3A, modified 3B, 2, and 6, and they were less supportive of 3B, 4, 5, 1A, and 1B in general.
Okay, thank you.
Director Groswald, do you still have a question?
Yeah, and I apologize. I came in late, so this may have been covered. But I saw the stakeholder working group list, and I just wondered if, for example, did the Canal Alliance take a position on a particular option?
So that's a good question. We had an exercise with the stakeholder working group where we asked them to sort of weigh in on which alternatives they would recommend not moving forward with. And so I don't have information on any particular entity's preference necessarily, but overall the group pretty much had the same results as what I just mentioned for the City of San Rafael. So more support for 3A, 3B, 2, and 6, and less support for 3B, the unmodified version, 4, and 5, as well as 1A and 1B. And I should also say, I mean, on 1A and 1B, there were some comments that supported these a little bit more because of the faster speeds and being further from the neighborhoods. But overall, the concerns about cost, environmental impacts, impacts to open space, impacts to property, I think outweighed the kind of more favorable comments from the overall stakeholder working group.
And the bicycle group, did they have any, the two bike groups, did they have strong opinions one way or the other?
You know, like I said, we just did the results as kind of a group activity. So I don't know how any individual member of the group sort of weighed in. I don't know, Dan Cherrier is here with me. He may remember more from that meeting or have those kind of individual results.
No, the actual process was done somewhat, blind, in that they put sticky notes on a virtual blackboard, so they did not identify who was saying what. But each of those groups got a sticky note to use to talk about which ones to keep or reject.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions or comments from board members?
Chair Fredericks, this is Director Rodoni.
Director Rodoni, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Fredericks. I just want to thank the TAM staff for their presentation today. And as you see, they worked really hard with so many alternatives to choose from to try and address a lot of issues. And as Dennis said, this is a really, really important project for our region. But even more so, it's a really important project for San Rafael, and in particular, East San Rafael. And I happen to represent East San Rafael in my supervisor district. So it's even become more important for me in my office to make sure that this whole process works well for that set of residents. As you may know, it includes the canal. It includes a lot of San Rafael businesses, which generate, I think, about 60% of the tax revenue for San Rafael. And it also represents Spinnaker Point and Bay Point, which are nicer residential areas of San Rafael. So there's a constituency here that has a huge interest in how this project goes forward. They're both short-term and long-term impacts on those communities. And I'm really happy that TAM has sort of taken the time to engage those communities. I do think there's more work to do. I do think that there's some conversations going around how do we look at this whole corridor as we do this process, and that may or may not even be in TAM's mission, but that discussion is happening, I think, around San Rafael and within the City Council of San Rafael. And so I'm just pleased with the progress at this point. I guess my one caution is I don't want to rush this to the point that we have some missteps and we don't make sure we address as many issues as we can going forward. But again, want to thank TAM for their presentation, and I know this is important to the Bridge District, and it's important to many, many stakeholders, and it's probably one of the more important projects in the region going forward, in addition to our own San Rafael Transit Center project. So we have a lot going on in this area, and just wanted to recognize that. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Rodoni. Are there any more comments?
This is Director.
All right, there was.
I'll wait, Alice. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So in view of Director Rodoni's statement comments just now, I will not be quite as full in my comments here, but I am encouraged that there will be high-level discussions of the transit corridor here more generally, rather above and beyond the specific project. I realize the limitations of this discussion of this particular project and acknowledge the work of TAM's staff on it. I in general wonder on a high level whether we are better off in the long run figuring out how to accommodate more fluid flow of higher volumes of traffic rather than figuring out how to reduce traffic altogether. such alternatives as a more robust public transit system. But that I realize will be the subject, probably one of the subjects of the discussions Director Rodoni has talked about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And are there any further comments?
Yes, Alice, this is Director Garbarino. Thank you.
Please proceed.
Thank you. I make my comments with the hopes that they are not perceived as self-serving, but in fact, to echo what Mike and Dennis just said, out of concern for the representation of the folks living in the canal area, there was a letter of opposition to options 1A and 1B submitted by the executive director of the Canal Alliance. So I'm specifically responding to Dick's question as well. Thanks for letting me comment.
Thank you, Director Garbarino. Are there any further comments or questions? So I would just like to make a brief high-level comment and thank the Transportation Authority of Marin and the staff for this early intensive engagement. It's very early in the process, and I am sure you will, and encourage you to continue this level of effort to outreach for input. And thank you for the presentation. All right. That concludes the discussion on this item. Madam Secretary, is there anyone from the public wishing to speak?
Yes, there is. We have David Pilpel on the line, I believe. In a second, let me introduce David. David, are you with us?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. Good morning. So on this item, transportation item 4, I am concerned about potential impacts to Golden Gate Transit Division 1, the San Rafael facility. I might suggest that as a mitigation or as a design feature for this project, perhaps direct on and off ramps to 580 to 101 to and from Division 1 just for transit would facilitate Golden Gate buses getting to and from where they need to go. That might be something that could be incorporated here. It would be great to also have direct rail access to Marin sanitary service facilities so that you could ship material in and out of that facility. I would wonder, though, if Director Garbarino might need to recuse on this item if it comes before the board again, but whatever. I appreciated the slide at the end with the rendering of a westbound 580 to southbound 101 connector. I think that should be planned or at least considered at this time, even if there's no identified funding. And I think the alternative summary table on slide 30 perhaps could have an additional column for whether the particular alternative facilitates a southbound 580 to 101 connector, because some of them have a more constrained right-of-way, and that would be more complicated. I think those are my comments at this point. I can follow up with Ann Richmond of TAM on any further comments or questions I might have. Nice to hear Ann, who I've known for many years from her days at SFMTA. Great, thanks.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment, Madam Secretary?
We have no further speakers.
Thank you. We will now continue on to Agenda Item 5, a monthly report on bridge traffic, transit ridership trends, and transit service performance. The staff report begins on page 33. Dennis, do you have anything to report related to this item?
Just the written report is before you, and it shows that travel in the Golden Gate corridor is still well down. Bridge traffic's down about 20%, but the commute period traffic is down about 33%. That's 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. in the morning. So people are traveling in the corridor more than they were in the early days of the pandemic, but the travel that's occurring is not commute travel. And then bus and ferry are also down significantly, as they have been. Bus has been flat for several months, and ferry is slowly inching up, which is encouraging. We did add a couple of ferry trips out of Larkspur in the September time period, as well as we added some bus trips, some additional trips in September. But I can talk more about that tomorrow under the GM report. But with that, I'm available to answer any questions that you might have.
Does anyone on the board have any questions or comments?
Just a quick question regarding the ferry. Does that include the special events?
We look at it both with and without. It does. This is a total number, but even without special events, Larkspur Ferry is starting to inch up. It's still way down than from where it was historically, but it's not as depressed as it was. September ferry ridership was down about 80%, but that's a lot better than it was, a year ago when it was down, 97%. And so we are seeing it to slowly inch up as a few people start returning to work in San Francisco. So that's why we added 2 trips back in September. We anticipate after the first of the year adding some more trips. But ridership is still very, very depressed, very, very low. And that won't change on the commute side of our business until downtown San Francisco reopens. It does appear that after the first year, a lot of companies will start bringing people back, those that still have leases in San Francisco, a couple days a week. And we look forward to that. And we look forward to adding service when that occurs.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Any other board members? Dennis, I would like to make a comment, and I know it's very difficult because any one route depends on its ridership and what's feasible to add on the whole system. But if there is any opportunity at all at the board meeting to include in the report some notion of the benchmarks that would trigger some increase in bus service, especially the questions I get are for Route 4 and, of course, the direct Tiburon to San Francisco route. Again, I think the public doesn't always realize that it's not who is standing in line to take any one bus or any one ferry trip, but any comments you could make on benchmarks would be very helpful.
Certainly. I could talk a little bit about it now. The key is that people are not going into San Francisco during the commute period in the morning via bridge, bus, or boat. So the travel is way down. If someone says that they're going to drive, if a Route 4 is not available, we would welcome the traffic in the morning because we're down 33% in the morning. With respect to Tiburon and Sausalito, we've been operating a triangle service during the pandemic with very limited service, so that makes it a longer ferry boat trip. We were doing that because ridership was so depressed. If a ferry boat picks up only 15 passengers in Tiburon, to have that boat go across the bay would be bad for our finances and bad for the environment. So we have been having that boat then go to Sausalito, where it picks up 30 more passengers, and then go across the bay. But we're looking at ending that triangle service in the middle of next month in anticipation of seeing a slow return of customers after the first of the year. With respect to the Route 4 service, at this juncture, we're not adding it back. We have a bus that stops at the Manzanita Park and Ride lot, which was serviced by the 4x4, so people can ride their bike or get dropped off there or park there. That lot is empty. And the Route 27 bus stops at the Manzanita Park and Ride lot. You can take people from that Mill Valley service area into San Francisco. We are starting to see the buses fill up a little bit more. There's very few of those, and we look forward to a day when people from Mill Valley, again, commute into San Francisco with some regularity. But we do have standards. Historically, the board adopted standards for commute service is that you want to have at least 20 passengers per bus on every trip going in. For a lot of our service up until about a month ago, crossing the bridge, virtually none of them had it. So we are encouraged that we're seeing a slight uptick, but the primary uptick we're seeing right now is out of Larkspur Ferry, and it's still very, very modest. There's still, 90% of that parking lot is empty, and so we have a lot of capacity. So we'll continue to report on that. We will add service back as customers return. We have added service a couple of times in the last few months. But everyone wants a trip for themselves, but to run a Route 4 bus that starts in downtown Mill Valley for 2 or 3 people doesn't work for the environment, doesn't work for our finances. But we are pleased that we are seeing a very slight uptick, but an uptick in the service from the Manzanita Park and Ride Lot that provides express service to the financial district via the Route 27.
Thank you, Dennis. Are there any further board member questions? If not, Madam Secretary, is anyone from the public wishing to speak? This is item 5.
We have no speakers on this item.
Thank you very much.
We have none.
All right. No action is required. This is an informational report. We'll move on now to item number 6, also an informational monthly report on activities related to Marin Transit. The brief staff report is on page 39. Dennis, do you have anything to report related to this?
Just that staff is actively negotiating with Marin Transit for a new multi-year contract for the provision of local bus service in Marin. You may recall that Marin Transit is the local bus provider in Marin County, and that they contract with the Bridge District to provide some of that service, and that the contract expired, so we did a 6-month extension. We look forward to bringing something to the board in the coming months to put in place a new multi-year agreement to maintain that relationship.
Thank you, Dennis. We look forward to that, too. Madam Secretary, are there any board members who have questions?
I don't see anyone lighting up on my screen there, so I'm going to say that we have no questions from directors on this item.
Thank you. That concludes director discussion. Is there anyone from the public wishing to speak on item 6? Or to address the committee under item 7, which is public comment? Do you see any, Madam Secretary?
Sorry about that. I was muted and talking to myself. We do not have any speakers for item 6, but I believe we do have a speaker under item number 7. So give me a second and double check. I believe David Pilpel wanted to speak under item 7 as well. David, are you still with us?
Can you hear me okay? I
can
am.
Hear you.
Are you? Excellent. Okay, David Pilpel again. So I decided not to comment on item 3, so I could just wrap it all up. Here, there was a Bus Passengers Advisory Committee meeting last night. I attended part of it. I support the changes to bus route numbers. I don't know if that's been reported to the board, but apparently there's a scheme underway to renumber Golden Gate's bus routes to all 3-digit numbers so as to avoid confusion with local routes. The 101 would stay the same, the 40 would become the 580, and the other routes, whether they're operating now or when they come back in the future, would have 3-digit numbers. I think that's great. I think it avoids confusion, and it would be fantastic if the other operators in the region did the same so as to avoid duplication, and that would be a great step in terms of regional coordination, things that agencies can do without legislation just by working together and doing the right thing for the public. So very supportive of that. Also, I note that the new proposed Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee that's going to be discussed shortly under Building and Operating could later be included with the Advisory Committee on Accessibility. It seems to me that I would start the new one as a separate Bicycle and Pedestrian Committee, but ultimately it seems to me that accessibility for persons with disabilities, as well as bicycle and pedestrian concerns about safety and access to district facilities and services might work well together, that people should be aware of other users and their concerns and issues, and maybe that would be a good way to cluster in the future. But I support starting the thing as just a separate Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. Those are my thoughts on general public comment. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for those comments. That concludes the meeting. May I have a motion to adjourn, please?
So moved, Rabbit.
Second.
Second.
And a second. Hearing no objections, this concludes this meeting of the Transportation Committee. Thank you, colleagues. The time is 9:50 a.m.